All right, shalom, shalom, and shalom. You are live and direct once again with your Akazaki Yahoo. I'm giving all praises, honor, and great esteem unto the Most High, Yahuwah Bashem, Yahushua Hamashiach, to the 12 tribes of Israel who are scattered to the four quarters of the earth. I'm going to say shalom wa baruchim. That is peace and blessings. And I cannot wait till the day when the Most High brings us back together and we are once again 12 tribes, one family, one nation under the Most High power, under one covenant, back in our own land with a heart of flesh and no more a heart of stone, with our enemies, our adversaries, and all those who hate us under our feet. Hallelujah.
Hallelujah.
I'm joined this evening by my most esteemed Ak Kenaniah. Shalom, Ak.
Hey, shalom, shalom, my key. Shalom, shalom, Yasharal. Happy new month.
Hallelujah. Yes, indeed. Happy new month. We call it new moon. And this is the first time you've been able to break bread with your Akeem on the new moon because your Akazaki Yahoo has been working for the past 7.5 years, second shift. And now I'm on first shift. All praises to the Abba for allowing,
Hallelujah.
yes, indeed, for allowing us to be able to get this thing together. So here we are. We done blew up the shofars, and we praise the Most High for the opportunity to get together. We got a video review we're going to jump into real quick and real easy for you. First video is brought to us by the good brothers over at Black Culture Unlocked. Shout out to those brothers for doing the work and putting these videos together. This is the Slocum Massacre of 1910, not taught in schools. I was unaware of this Slocum Massacre in 1910, but we're about to be educated. So here we go.
History often paints a polished picture of progress and unity, but underneath that surface are unbelievable, harrowing stories that were deliberately hidden for decades. This is the story of the Slocum Massacre. Slocum, Texas, an unassuming community where an explosion of racial hatred turned a quiet town into a battleground of terror. What happened here in July 1910 wasn't just a sad tragedy, but an atrocity. A massacre that left countless black men, women, and children dead, their blood soaking the soil of their homes. It wasn't just the magnitude of the violence that shocked the conscience, but the unadulterated brutality of it. Innocent people were hunted down like animals, gunned down as they ran for their lives. Homes were burned, families instantly torn apart, and a vibrant and thriving black community was wiped away from the map. This vicious act did not happen by mistake, but was a deliberate and coordinated act of terror. Yet despite the intensity of this horror, the Slocum Massacre is a chapter that most history books refuse to acknowledge. It's a story that has been buried under layers of denial, removed from the official records of Texas and the United States, as if the lives that were lost were not worth remembering. The truth is, the Slocum Massacre wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a broader pattern of racial violence that was designed to instill fear and suppress the civil rights and progress of blacks. Thriving black communities were being systematically destroyed across the country, and Slocum became yet another example of the lengths some would go to maintain white supremacy. Imagine this. It's a sweltering summer day in 1910. Black residents in Slocum are going about their lives. Some work on their land, run their businesses, raise their children, and carry out various activities. Then, without warning, a mob of armed white men invades the community. They came with rifles, pistols, and shotguns. Their faces were twisted with hate. They don't ask questions. They don't issue warnings. They simply kill indiscriminately and without mercy. Witnesses later described men being shot as they tried to hide in the woods. Women and children weren't spared either. The bodies of the dead were littered all over the ground. Their lives came to an end in an instant. One survivor who trembled in fear later recounts how the mob showed no remorse, no hesitation. "They hunted us like we were animals," they said. And when the slaughter was over, the survivors were forced to flee, leaving everything they had worked for behind. For over a century, this dark chapter was suppressed. Local newspapers at the time claimed the violence was justified, painting the black community as the aggressor. Meanwhile, it was only a tactic that is too familiar in cases of racial violence. No one was ever held accountable, justice was never served, and the victims' stories were left to fade into obscurity. In this video, we'll ensure that this story is no longer forgotten. We will revisit the truth of what happened in Slocum, Texas in July 1910, not just to recount the events, but to honor the lives that were lost, uncover the lasting scars, and confront the deep-rooted hatred that led to such dark atrocity. In the early 1900s, America was a nation of direct opposite to what you see it as now. It was a total stark contrast. The country boasted of prosperity and progress in some sectors while struggling with deeply entrenched racial divisions in others. This was even more evident in the South compared to other locations because Jim Crow laws were more dominant in the South, and Black communities lived under the constant shadow of oppression. To understand the Slocum Massacre of 1910, let's explore the powder keg of racial tension that existed at the time and how it affected the lives of those in Slocum, Texas. The early 19th and early 20th centuries saw significant strides in industry and innovation, but life remained a battle for basic human dignity for Black Americans. The Reconstruction period following the Civil War had ended in 1877, leaving Black communities vulnerable as federal protections had gradually worn away. The resurgence of white supremacy manifested in laws, policies, and practices designed to disenfranchise and oppress Black citizens across the South. Like much of the South, Black Americans were systematically excluded from political power, economic opportunities, and education in Texas. Jim Crow laws reinforced segregation, which created a society where Black people were considered second-class citizens. Schools, public spaces, transportation, and even drinking fountains were separate and far from equal. Between 1880 and 1930, thousands of lynchings took place, with Texas being among the states that had the highest figures. These horrific acts were often celebrated by the local white populations, further highlighting the dehumanization of Black lives. Slocum was a small, unincorporated community in Anderson County, Texas. This community was no exception to this broader racial dynamic. By 1910, Slocum was a rural settlement that was populated by farmers, laborers, and traders. Among its residents were an increasing number of Black families who were beginning to build a good life for themselves despite the odds that stood against them. Black residents in Slocum were known for their industrious and hardworking attributes. They worked the land, owned property, and ran businesses, gradually building a foundation of economic stability. This success symbolized hope for many. A future where they could provide for their families and contribute to their communities. However, this success did not come without consequences. The prosperity of Black residents was often perceived as a threat to their white neighbors. Stories of hard-working Black families acquiring land or wealth became a subject of jealousy and resentment. A toxic narrative began to spread. Black people didn't know their place and were disrupting the status quo. Economic disparities only made this tension more intense. The predominantly white elite in Texas was in control of most of the wealth, yet even modest achievements by Black families were seen as challenges to white dominance. This pervasive attitude created an environment where violence against Black communities could erupt at the slightest provocation. The intense racism of the era went far beyond interpersonal prejudices. The legal system, local governance, and law enforcement were all tools used to maintain white supremacy. Black citizens in Slocum and similar towns experienced immense barriers to justice. Laws were enforced selectively, often punishing Black residents more severely than their white colleagues for the same offenses, or punishing them for crimes that did not exist. Police and local officials frequently turned a blind eye to violence against Black citizens, if not actively participating in it. This imbalance created a society where Black people were left vulnerable, unable to trust the very systems that were supposed to protect them. Rumors, often unfounded but deadly in their consequences, made matters even worse. Stories of supposed Black progress and developmental or violent plots against white communities spread like wildfire across the South. These baseless rumors were enough to spark mob violence, leading to countless tragedies like the Slocum Massacre. By 1910, tensions in Slocum had reached a boiling point. The successes of Black residents were no longer just a quiet source of envy. They were perceived as a direct challenge to the white authority. Local whites began to circulate rumors of a potential black insurrection. Though this narrative was entirely fabricated, tapped into the deep-seated fears of white residents who saw their dominance slipping away. At the same time, black families in Slocum were simply trying to live their normal lives. They worked tirelessly to provide for their children and establish a sense of security in an uncertain world. But even their modest dreams were seen as provocations in a society that was bent on suppressing them. The stage was set for an unforgettable tragedy. The toxic combination of systemic oppression, economic jealousy, and fear created a volatile environment where the slightest spark could ignite a firestorm. Like this video and subscribe to this channel as we journey further to understand the Slocum Massacre and recount the events of that fateful day. As we delve further into this dark chapter of history, it's important to remember the people at the heart of this story. They were more than victims of violence. They were individuals with hopes, dreams, and dignity, living in a society that sought to deny them all three. In the early summer of 1910, the air in East Texas felt heavy and tense. Families who had worked hard to carve out a slice of prosperity in a land that was characterized by systemic oppression were now living in uneasy peace with their white neighbors. But beneath the surface, jealousy and fear lingered, a cauldron waiting to boil over. The root of the massacre was the growing success of black residents in Slocum. At the time, this was a dangerous position for any black community to hold. Many black families in Slocum were striving for economic independence. This defied the societal norms imposed by the Jim Crow South, where black people were expected to remain subservient and dependent. White residents perceived this success with suspicion and resentment. The prosperity of the black community was not just a threat to their economic dominance, but was an affront to the racial hierarchy that governed every aspect of Southern life. Whispered conversations in general stores, glances exchanged at church gatherings, and muttered grievances began to grow into something far more menacing. By July 1910, the tensions reached a breaking point. Rumors began to spread wild, baseless claims that the black residents of Slocum were planning an armed uprising. The origins of these rumors remain unclear, but their impact was significantly felt. Stories of stockpiles of weapons and secret meetings rapidly spread with alarming speed, fueled by paranoia and racial animosity. The specific spark that ignited the massacre can be traced to a seemingly mundane event, a business disagreement. A black man, Abe Wilson by name, had been engaged in a financial transaction with a white man. The details of the dispute have been lost to history, but what is known is that the altercation escalated beyond words. The white man's anger quickly turned into a rallying cry, one that was eagerly taken up by others in the community. In the racially charged environment of the time, a simple disagreement was all it took to justify violence against the black community. Wilson simply standing up for himself in the dispute was perceived as defiance. This was enough to enrage local whites. Soon, whispers of his supposed insolence transformed into accusations of a broader conspiracy, feeding the growing hysteria. If there was any hope of diffusing the situation, it was extinguished by the actions or inaction of local authorities. Instead of calming tensions, they added fuel to the flames. Local officials who were influenced by the same racial prejudices as the mob lent credence to the baseless rumors of an uprising. Reports suggest that some officials even encouraged white residents to defend themselves against the supposed threat. Sheriff William H. Black, a key figure in Anderson County, issued inflammatory statements that further escalated the situation. His words were far from being a call for peace and became a rallying cry for violence. It didn't take long for this delusional disorder to metamorphose into outright violence. White residents began arming themselves, forming impromptu militias, and roaming the countryside in search of evidence of the alleged uprising. The mere sight of black men traveling on the roads was enough to spark a confrontation. One account narrates of a young black man who was stopped by a group of armed whites. When he denied knowing of any conspiracy, he was beaten and left dead. Such incidents became commonplace in the days leading up to the massacre, creating an atmosphere of terror among black residents. The black community in Slocum was not oblivious to the growing danger. Many residents had heard the rumors and seen the warning signs. Some fled, leaving behind their homes and belongings in the hope of finding safety in a different community. Others tried to stay, with the belief or perhaps hoping that reason would prevail. As the fateful day drew nigh, the tension in Slocum was more palpable. Black residents were warned to stay indoors or leave town entirely. The streets became abnormally quiet as fear gripped the community. Meanwhile, white residents gathered in groups, their conversations punctuated by the ominous clatter of rifles and shotguns being loaded. A narrative has it that a local black pastor spoke to his congregation, urging them to remain calm and pray for peace. His words were meant to reassure, but they betrayed his uncertainty. Just like many others, he understood that prayer alone might not be enough to stop what was coming. On the evening of July 29, 1910, the powder keg finally exploded. Accounts vary as to what happened, but many point to a confrontation between a group of armed whites and a black resident who was accused of threatening violence. The details of the encounter are hidden in the chaos of the time, but the outcome was clear. The white mob used the incident as a justification to unleash their fury. Within hours, the violence had spread like wildfire. Armed groups of white men descended upon the black community, targeting homes, businesses, and individuals with ruthless efficiency. The massacre had begun, and there was no turning back. What makes this event particularly chilling is the psychology behind it. The mob's actions were not the result of a spontaneous outburst, but the culmination of years of systemic racism, economic envy, and social conditioning. The fear of an armed black uprising was a convenient excuse, but the underlying motive was clear: to reassert white dominance and crush any atom of black progress. This mentality was not unique to Slocum. Across the South, similar massacres occurred whenever black communities dared to defy the status quo. As the first shots were fired, the mob's frenzy reached a fever pitch. Families were forced to flee into the woods, abandoning their homes and livelihoods in a desperate bid to survive. Those who couldn't escape met unspeakable brutality. The exact number of lives that were lost remains uncertain, but estimates suggest that dozens, if not hundreds, of black residents were killed in the massacre. Survivors later recounted harrowing stories of hiding in swamps and forests, listening to the sounds of gunfire and screams as the mob tore through their community. The events of the Slocum Massacre unfolded with a terrifying precision that betrayed their spontaneous appearance. While the violence erupted seemingly without warning, its orchestration and execution revealed a darker truth. This was not a random outburst of chaos, but a calculated act of terror designed to victimize the black community in Slocum. That fateful day, around mid-morning of July 29, 1910, the first signs of trouble began to appear. Groups of armed white men were spotted gathering along the roads leading into Slocum. Their presence, though intimidating, was not entirely unexpected. For days, these groups had been patrolling the area under the guise of self-defense. That morning, however, their intentions were far more evil. As the hours passed by, the population increased in size. White men from neighboring towns joined the gathering, armed with different forms of ammunition. The sheer number of armed men was estimated to be in the hundreds. This number was enough to send waves of fear through the black community. Those who had doubted the rumors of violence now faced the harsh reality that their lives were in extreme danger. Early in the afternoon, the situation reached a boiling point. Historians suggest that an armed group of whites encountered a black man on a rural road. The confrontation escalated quickly, and shots were fired. This initial violence was a signal, unleashing a torrent of coordinated attacks against the black residents of Slocum. Within minutes, the roads that led into town became killing fields. Armed whites roamed the countryside, targeting anyone they came across. Homes were set ablaze, families were dragged from their houses, and those who tried to flee were hunted down. The attacks were indiscriminate, sparing neither the elderly nor children. For many black residents, survival depended on quick thinking and the courage to face the unknown. One survivor, whose account was recorded several years later, recalled the moment she and her family fled away from their home. "We heard them coming," she said. "The sound of horses' hooves and men shouting. My father grabbed us and told us to run. We didn't have time to pack anything. Not food, not clothes, just run." She and her siblings stumbled into the thick woods behind their house, barefoot and afraid. For hours, they stayed in silence, hearing gunfire and screams in the distance. "We didn't know if we'd ever see each other again," she recounted. "The fear was like nothing I've ever felt before." For days, this family survived on berries and stream water, moving only at night to avoid detection. When they finally emerged, their home was reduced to ashes, and the community they used to know was gone. One story that has been spread is about a man named Isaac Daniels, who was a farmer and father of 3. Daniels was known in Slocum as a man of principle, a hard worker who had earned the respect of both black and white residents. On the day of the massacre, Daniels sent his family into hiding, knowing full well the danger that stands before them. But instead of fleeing with them, he stayed behind. He was determined to protect their home and livelihood. Daniels took up a position near his barn and was armed with nothing but an old hunting rifle. When the mob arrived, they demanded that Daniels leave. "This land is ours now," one of them reportedly shouted. Daniels refused, standing his ground even as the mob grew more hostile and aggressive. Some witnesses later recounted that Daniels fired a single warning shot into the air. The mob responded with a hail of bullets, killing him on the spot. His body was left where it fell as a grim message to anyone who dared to resist. The massacre showed mercy to no one, not even the youngest and most vulnerable personality. One particular story that breaks the heart is the account of a young boy who witnessed the horrors firsthand. At just 10 years old, he had to watch as his family was torn apart. "They came to our house at night," he later recounted. "They were yelling and shooting. My mama told me to hide under the bed and not make a sound." The boy saw his father dragged outside and beaten from his hiding place. His mother tried to intervene, only for her to be struck down. "I wanted to scream, but I couldn't," he said. "I just stayed there, shaking, wishing it was all a bad dream." The boy eventually ran into the woods, where he wandered alone for days before being found by a sympathetic family in a neighboring town. Though he survived, the trauma of that night lasted with him for the rest of his life. The women of Slocum displayed extraordinary courage in the face of unimaginable violence. One of such women, who is known only as Sarah, became a symbol of resilience for her community. When the mob reached Sarah's home, they set it on fire, forcing her and her children to leave. But Sarah refused to leave empty-handed. As flames consumed her house, she ran back inside to retrieve a family Bible, a symbol of her faith and heritage. Emerging from the smoke with her children and the Bible in hand, Sarah led her family into the woods. For weeks, she kept them alive, relying on her knowledge of the land to find food and water. Years later, Sarah's descendants would preserve that same Bible as a testament to her strength and determination. Many of the massacre's victims were buried in hastily dug graves. Their names and stories were lost to history. For their families, the pain of losing loved ones was compounded by the inability to grieve publicly. One woman whose husband and son were killed during the massacre spoke of how isolated she felt in the aftermath. "I couldn't even cry where people could see me," she said. "They'd think I was causing trouble, so I cried in secret every night until there were no tears left." This forced silence was emblematic of the larger societal effort to erase the massacre from memory. Families were left to mourn their grief, overshadowed by the fear of further retaliation in private. Despite the efforts to silence them, the survivors of the Slocum Massacre found ways to preserve their stories. Oral histories became a lifeline that ensured that the memories of those who were lost would not fade away. One elderly woman, speaking decades after the massacre, described the importance of sharing these stories with the younger generation. She said, "We have to tell it, not because it's easy, but because it's true. If we don't, they'll pretend it never happened." These stories, though painful, have become a vital part of the community's identity. The event is a reminder of the horrors of the past and a call to action for the future. These stories of the Slocum Massacre's victims are not just tales of suffering, they are also stories of resilience, courage, and the enduring human spirit. Each story, whether it ends in tragedy or survival, adds another layer to our understanding of this dark chapter in history. Their stories remind us that history is not just a series of events. It is the lived experience of real people, each with their dreams, fears, and hopes. In telling these stories, we ensure that the victims of the Slocum Massacre are not forgotten. Their voices that have been silenced in life speak to us through the echoes of time, urging us to remember, to learn, and to strive for a future where such atrocities never occur again. The Slocum Massacre was not just the result of individual prejudice. It was aggravated by the collective power of mob mentality. This psychological phenomenon occurs when individuals in a group abandon personal responsibility and adopt a shared mindset that is often extreme. It transforms ordinary people into perpetrators of unspeakable violence and creates a dangerous environment where accountability is drowned out by the overwhelming influence of the group. In Slocum, mob mentality was caused by a combination of racial fear, economic anxiety, and enduring prejudices. Rumors of a supposed black uprising, though entirely baseless, spread rapidly and ignited paranoia among the white population. Individuals began to band together with a conviction that they were acting in self-defense or preserving the social order. This was fueled by fear and misinformation. Mob mentality also thrives on dehumanization. It was a critical factor in the Slocum Massacre. The mob saw black residents as threats to be eliminated rather than neighbors or individuals. This dehumanization made it easier for participants to justify their actions, convincing themselves that they were protecting their community rather than destroying it. Another aspect of mob mentality is the suppression of dissent. Those who might have objected to the violence were forced to remain silent, either out of fear of becoming targets themselves or due to the overwhelming pressure to conform. In Slocum, the few voices of reason were drowned out by the mob's collective roar, ensuring that the violence continued at full strength. The role of mob mentality in the Slocum Massacre highlights the dangers of unchecked groupthink and the power of fear to override individual morality. It is a stark reminder of how ordinary people can easily become complicit in extraordinary violence when swept up by the tides of collective, uncontrolled behavioral exhibits. The events of those horrific days had transformed the town into a dark town. The event turned what was once a vibrant black community into a ghost of its former self. For black residents who survived the massacre, the priority was to survive. Many families fled, leaving behind their homes, possessions, and land. Many walked for miles to neighboring towns, carrying only what they could hold. Some found refuge with relatives or sympathetic communities, while others were forced to start a new life with nothing but the clothes on their bodies. Survivors carried the weight of trauma with them, being haunted by memories of violence and loss. Many never returned to Slocum because of the fear of further retaliation or unable to bear the pain of revisiting the place where their lives were torn apart. The physical structure of Slocum bore the marks of the massacre. These acts were calculated efforts to erase the black presence from the town. The white perpetrators of the massacre quickly seized the opportunity to claim abandoned land, strengthening their control over the community. This economic exploitation was a continuation of the violence that ensured that black families lost their lives and also their livelihoods. The failure of the justice system of the time was one of the most devastating aspects of the aftermath. Efforts to hold the perpetrators accountable were half-hearted at best, while reports of the massacre reached state and national levels. A grand jury convened to investigate the massacre, and several white men were arrested. However, none were ever convicted. Witnesses were too terrified to testify, and the pervasive racism of the era ensured that even the most obvious evidence was ignored. The message was clear: the lives of black residents were expendable, and their killers would face no consequences. This failure of justice emboldened those who believed that such acts of violence could be committed with impunity. In the immediate aftermath, the story of the Slocum Massacre was deliberately silenced. Local newspapers undermined the violence, describing it as a riot and implying that black residents were at fault. This narrative erased their experiences and perpetuated the lie that the massacre was justified. Survivors and their descendants were often reluctant to speak publicly about what had happened, fearing retaliation or stigma. This silence created a void in the historical record, which allowed the massacre to fade from the memory of the public for decades. The trauma of the Slocum Massacre had long-lasting effects on its survivors. Many suffered from what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, though such conditions were poorly understood at the time. Children who witnessed the violence grew up with the knowledge of this horrible experience they had seen that shattered their innocence. Adults struggled to rebuild their lives, often facing ongoing discrimination and economic hardship. For many, the massacre was not just a singular event, but the beginning of a lifetime of struggle. The immediate aftermath of the Slocum Massacre showcased the broader societal failure to confront and address racial violence. The nation missed an opportunity to reckon with its history and prevent future atrocities by refusing to acknowledge the truth. Instead, the cycle of violence and injustice continued, allowing communities like Slocum to bear the brunt of its consequences. This economic loss was devastating. Black families who had worked tirelessly and relentlessly to build their lives from scratch were left with nothing to show for it. The generational wealth they could have passed on to their children and grandchildren was taken away, creating a cycle of poverty. For many descendants of the victims, the economic impact of the massacre is still very much felt today and reflected in disparities in property ownership and financial security. The loss of such communities had broad consequences across the country. Events like the Slocum Massacre served as warnings to other Black communities, reinforcing fear and distrust. Many Black families, even in other regions, curtailed their ambitions, knowing that success could make them targets for white resentment and violence. The erasure of this massacre remains one of the most egregious aspects of the event. It denied justice to the victims and allowed the perpetrators to escape accountability. It also robbed future generations of the opportunity to learn from the past. Without widespread acknowledgement of what happened, the conditions that allowed the massacre to occur remained unaddressed, which gave room to the continuation of racial violence in America. The fear and inequality that were created by events like the Slocum Massacre continued to influence policies and attitudes. Discriminatory laws, unequal access to education and employment, and the systematic disenfranchisement of Black Americans were all reinforced by the culture of racial terror that the massacre caused. In recent years, there has been a growing movement to shed light on the Slocum Massacre and other similar events in American history. Historians, activists, and descendants of the victims have worked tirelessly and relentlessly to uncover the truth and demand recognition. In 2011, more than a century after the massacre, the state of Texas finally acknowledged the events, erecting a historical marker near the site of the violence. While this was a significant step, it was only a small gesture compared to the enormity of the tragedy. However, true justice would involve not only acknowledgement, but also reparations for the descendants of the victims and systemic changes to address the ongoing effects of racial inequality. Despite the devastation wrought by the Slocum Massacre, survivors and their descendants have fought to preserve their history and reclaim the true narrative. The Slocum Massacre isn't just a story from the past, but a mirror that reflects the ongoing struggles of racial inequality in America. The consequences of this event transcend through generations, manifesting in economic disparities, social exclusion, and the erasure of Black contributions to society. While we cannot change the past, we can choose how we honor it. Reinvestigating the Slocum Massacre is a step toward justice, not the kind that comes with courtrooms and verdicts, but the justice of acknowledgement and remembrance. It's about giving a voice to those who were silenced and ensuring their stories are not lost to time. If we are to heal, we must first confront the wounds that have been ignored for far too long. The Slocum Massacre is one of many, but by shining a light on this tragedy, we honor all who have suffered under the weight of injustice. And so, as we uncover the truths of Slocum and other forgotten stories, let us carry forward a commitment to change. Let us confront America's dark past, not to dwell in shame, but to pave the way for a brighter, more equitable future.
Man, I tell you what, that is a horrible story. Absolutely egregious. And I, you know, here's the reality, because that situation should have never been able to happen. You should have never been able to have a group of outsiders come into a community and bring terror, because the community should have banded together and said, "There's some crazy suckers out here. Let's go handle them." And they should have been on their behind as soon as they figured out they was there, and they was there to cause trouble. So I really hate that situation. It's and don't get me wrong. I'm not making light of it. I'm not trying to blame the victims. I know in a society where we are the minority, and you got a bunch of you got other people ruling over you. It's difficult, but that's why you really got to stand up for yourself. Because truthfully, I mean that what else is going to happen? You think they just going to, okay, all right, I see you scared, so we're going to go ahead and about our business. No, that's not going to happen. They're going to continue and continue terrorizing the people, the families, and these men, these brothers should have been protecting these families instead of just running them off. And again, I'm not trying to blame the victims. I mean, this is just a horrible situation to deal with. And I know it's not as simple as, oh, go get your gun. And that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, in a community, you got to have some camaraderie. You probably had, I don't know what occurred that kept that from happening, because it should have been every man in that community should have been together and went up against those cats until it was nothing left, truthfully, because they sought to destroy, completely and utterly destroy that community, and they apparently they did so. The one lady said, well, the report said that the lady said that when she came back, there was nothing left of her house but ash. So, I mean, what else is supposed to happen in a situation like that? But I give from there. Go ahead, Aki.
Con, definitely a terrible event for our people. I was getting ready to say a terrible time, but I looked throughout history, and it's all been a terrible time. I'm doing some researching as the video's playing, and one of the sheriffs, in the aftermath, conducted an investigation, and his name was Sheriff William Black, and he said that men were going about killing Negroes as fast as they could find them. And so far as I was able to ascertain without any real cause. He also described it as there was just a hot-headed gang hunting them down and killing them. Speaking about, our people, they were just hunting the Negroes down like sheep. So in the aftermath, they ended up charging 11 men, most of who had multiple murder charges. Like, maybe one out of the 11, one or two of them had only one murder charge, but the rest of them had 3 to 4 murder charges each. Right. Out of that 11,
0.
All but 2, 2 of them were just released. The other 9 had to pay $1,500. $1,500 to be released, and they were never brought up on any charges, man. It's very, very upsetting, and here's the thing: we know these individuals' names. Yeah. The government for so long didn't even want to acknowledge the massacre, but they put up a marker now. But the government at one point was, didn't even want to address the issue. Wow. And I'll tell you why it's upsetting. Because you talk about our people trying to make the best out of the situation. This not being their home, understanding that people hate them, and knowing that they had recently been freed from chattel slavery. They built homes and had gardens and were functioning in their community. And as we've seen in other instances, the Gentiles come and burn the town down. Right. Then, 40 years later, the push for integration is going on, and we don't benefit from integration. We don't benefit. In fact, we lose. We lose with integration, but they win with that, and not only that, they give us MLK Day. You know, it's like we take away your own and your sense of identity and sense of building your own community, force you to join ours, kill the man who wanted to integrate, but then later understood that really wasn't his dream, you know, and understanding that he's leading his people into a burning building the moment he realizes that you cut him down, and then memorialize his life and and give us a day and just tell us to be glad with it and happy with it and forget about it and don't mention these atrocities that happen. I say no, we will not forget. We will not ever stop talking about this until justice is served by Hashem HaMashiach Yahushua.
Khan. Yeah, it's crazy. It's absolutely crazy to that these things would just happen and would put our people at a place where it's just, you know, nothing. Like you can literally do nothing. And here's the sad part. I mean, that's the reality of the situation. You know, if we're not prepared, if we're not prepared for things to go awry, they could do that at any given time.
And exactly, and it's really not, the idea is not like where or how, it's when.
Right.
It's when is this going to occur again? You know, we need to pay attention when we're at the grocery stores, when we're at the gas stations. We need to be mindful of arguing with people. You know, this is their stomping ground. You know, we're not at liberty to really have a stomping ground and not be behind enemy grounds. We need to start moving military mindedly, you know, and arming ourselves and knowing how to use our weapons and being ready to use your weapon when the time arises.
Yeah, indeed, Aki. I mean, we definitely got to be prepared. You know, I really hate being in that society, in that community, we're not prepared, because some opposition could have shut down that whole thing, or could have at least quarreled it a bit. But to you know, I don't know what happened and how they weren't. But you know, it's, as a man, you are responsible for your house. And don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to say that they could have just handled it and everything would have been all right. That's not what I'm saying. But at the same time, uh, if I know that I got brothers or I got people I can count on, you know, next door, two doors down, the next block, whatever the case, then by all means, if some funk pop off, if it get crazy, if some crazy things happen, then we're gonna have to get this thing together. Because what I can't have is my mother, my children, my wife just be unprotected, uncovered, and nothing. You know, that's just it. That's the end of it. No. We can't have that. We can't let that be the case. You know what I'm saying? We can't be the story that they tell. Um, Nothing happened, or nothing was. You know, nothing was resolved. It just went the way it went, and that's the end of it. Like that's unacceptable. Completely
Uh,
unacceptable. So, all right, we're gonna go ahead and jump to the next video. As difficult as this one was, this one is titled "The Story," the untold story of the reverse Underground Railroad. So, We're all familiar with the Underground Railroad. So imagine the Underground Railroad in reverse. What does that mean? Let's get to it and get through it. Here we go.
Just north of the town of Wabunsee stands a marker in honor of the diverse, brave men and women who traveled to that area. The sign reads, Ad Astra per Aspera, which means a rough road leads to the stars. That monument has more meaning than most people know.
The journey to freedom was unlike the highway tolls that you and I pay today. Braving the Underground Railroad guaranteed exhaustion, mental, physical, and psychological. Thousands tried to pay the toll for freedom. Only a few made it, and the ones that didn't were sent back to the farms they tried to escape from.
It is estimated that between 20,000 and 30,000 slaves were held along the western border of Missouri, but over 115,000 statewide. Although most slaveholders had fewer than 10 slaves, the work that was required of them was every bit as grueling as those on larger plantations in the South. Still, due to their smaller size, it gave the opportunity for slaves to look beyond their masters' farms and to establish connections on other farms that would enable some of them to escape.
It's a story that can't be forgotten because there's so much injustice. There's so much hatred. And it's something that we can't ever allow to happen again in our country and in the greater sense in the whole world. The best way that we can fight ignorance is to educate. And so kids need to know this story about human injustice, about doing what is right, about going and believing in something to the point where you take action on it.
Every day across the United States, school children recite the Pledge of Allegiance. The last sentence states, with liberty and justice for all. That liberty and justice came at a price. In America, between 1607 and 1865, African Americans didn't have their freedom. During this time period, they fought to be free. However, their story has often been excluded from the American experience. Why? Because most of their stories come from the oral tradition. And until the Civil Rights era, their story wasn't considered important. African Americans, Native Americans, and Euro Americans worked together here in Kansas between 1854 and 1861 to make Kansas a free state. They established the western edge of the Underground Railroad in this country, which started a long journey to liberty and justice.
Imagine a world where the lines between liberty and bondage blur, where the quest for liberation did lead individuals back into the depths of servitude, a world where the promise of freedom is a mere illusion, leading to more unimaginable bondage, where the air is riddled with the tension of uncertainty and safety is nowhere near assurance. It was from slavery to slavery. That's the very essence of the counterfeit Underground Railroad called the Reverse Underground Railroad. In the annals of American history, there was this place once called the Underground Railroad, which served as a beacon of hope and resilience, a clandestine network that guided countless enslaved individuals to freedom. Yet, lurking in the shadows of this celebrated narrative is a lesser known, yet equally compelling story, the reverse Underground Railroad, revealing a chilling reality of where the very same routes that once led to liberation were repurposed to ensnare free Black people and enslaved individuals alike, dragging them back into the depths of bondage and slavery. Join us on this journey as we peel back the layers of history to reveal the untold story of the reverse Underground Railroad, with us examining first a narrative that vividly reflects the real experiences of countless enslaved individuals who endured unimaginable suffering and yet held on to hope for a better future, leading them to embrace the freedom the Underground Railroad offered. But before we proceed, do not forget to support our efforts by hitting that like button before you. Share with your family and friends to keep spreading our eye-opening Black narrative, and kindly subscribe to stay tuned in for more informative stories ahead. Now to the crux of the matter. The history of slavery is marked by profound suffering and inhumanity, and the experiences of enslaved individuals varied widely, depending on the time, period, location, and specific circumstances. Here is a narrative that reflects the harsh realities faced by many enslaved people, drawing on historical accounts and testimonies. In the early 19th century, in the American South, a young woman named Eliza was born into slavery on a cotton plantation. From a young age, she was aware of her status as property, not a person. The plantation owner, Mr. Thompson, was known for his brutal methods of maintaining control over his slaves. The air was thick with the scent of cotton and the sounds of whips cracking, a constant reminder of the harsh reality of their existence. As Eliza grew older, she would be assigned to the fields, where she would work from dawn till dusk, picking cotton under the scorching sun. The overseer, Mr. Jenkins, a cruel individual, would patrol the rows with a whip in hand, ready to punish anyone who dared to slow down or falter. Eliza witnessed her fellow slaves endure horrific beatings for minor infractions. One day, she saw a man, Samuel by name, who had been unable to keep up due to exhaustion, receiving a brutal lashing that left his back raw and bleeding. This sad sight would haunt her unendingly, a grim reminder of the price of disobedience. The physical toll of the work was immense. Eliza's hands were calloused and sore from the constant plucking of cotton bolls, and her back would ache from bending over for hours on end. The psychological torment was equally devastating. Families were often torn apart, sold to different plantations without warning. Eliza's mother had been sold when she was just a child, and the pain of that loss lingered in her heart. At night, after a long day in the fields, Eliza and the other slaves would gather in the small quarters they shared. The air was thick with despair, but they found solace in each other's company. They would share stories, sing songs of hope, and dream of freedom. Yet, the fear of the overseer loomed large. If caught, they could face severe punishment. On a particular night, a group of slaves were discovered trying to escape. The next morning, the plantation was eerily quiet, and Eliza learned that the escapees had been captured and publicly whipped as a warning to others. The psychological manipulation was relentless. Mr. Thompson would often remind them that they were nothing without him, that they were lucky to have a roof over their heads and food to eat. He would parade his wealth and power, reminding them of their place in the world. Eliza felt the weight of his words, internalizing the belief that she was less than human. As the years passed, Eliza's spirit began to wane. The hope of freedom seemed distant, overshadowed by the daily brutality of her existence. She witnessed the horrors of the auction block, where families were separated and individuals were sold to the highest bidder. The cries of mothers and children echoed in her mind, a haunting reminder of the fragility of their lives. One fateful day, a new slave arrived at the plantation. His name was James, and he carried with him a spark of defiance. He spoke of the Underground Railroad, a network of individuals who helped enslaved people escape to freedom. Eliza felt a flicker of hope reignite within her. Together, they began to dream of a life beyond the plantation, a life where they could be free. But the risks were immense. They knew that if caught, the consequences would be dire. The thought of being whipped, or worse, was a constant fear. Yet the desire for freedom was stronger than the fear of punishment. They would begin to plan their escape, gathering supplies and mapping out their route under the cover of darkness. And then on this particular moonless night, Eliza and James would make their move. They slipped away from the quarters, hearts pounding with fear and excitement. The journey was fraught with danger, as they navigated through the woods, avoiding patrols and relying on the stars to guide them through. Each rustle in the bushes sent shivers down their spines, but they pressed on, driven by the hope of a new life. After days of dangerous travel, they finally reached a safe house, where they were welcomed by abolitionists who offered them food and shelter. Eliza felt a sense of relief wash over her, but she knew their journey was far from over. The scars of her past would remain, but she was determined to forge a new path, one where she could live as a free woman. Eliza's case gives a clear scenario of what enslaved Africans go through. And worse in this dark age, how many have risked their lives in a bid to opt out from the shackles and harsh conditions of slavery into an outside world that promises freedom. Their sure escape route was, of course, through the Underground Railroad operated by notable abolitionists like Harriet Tubman, who was one of the figures related to the Underground Railroad. Tubman had escaped from enslavement in 1849 and went to Philadelphia, where she vowed to return for other members of her family and to help others escape. And being true to her words, she made her first trip back to the South after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 and returned a total of 13 times to the South, where she would help more than 300 people escape slavery. Her life and character are an outstanding example of selfless dedication to freedom and the abolition of slavery. Now to the story of the Underground Railroad. For several decades up until the start of the Civil War, the network known as the Underground Railroad operated in the U.S. to help slaves escape into the northern states and sometimes to Canada. Despite the name, the network was not actually a railroad, but a series of safe houses and special routes slaves could use during their escape toward freedom. Also, the Underground Railroad did not actually run underground, but through homes, barns, churches, and businesses. And according to some estimates, between 1810 and 1850, the Underground Railroad had helped to guide 100,000 enslaved people to freedom. Impressive, isn't it? While patrols seeking to catch enslaved people were frequently hot on escapees' heels, lanterns in the windows of the Underground Railroad welcomed them and promised safety. Although enslaved Africans and African Americans escaped from slavery as early as the 16th century, with many of their escapes unaided, the network of safe houses operated by agents, generally known as the Underground Railroad, began to organize in the 1780s among abolitionist societies in the North. It ran north and grew steadily until the Emancipation Proclamation was signed in 1863 by President Abraham Lincoln. The escapees sought primarily to escape into free states and from there to Canada. However, the network, which was primarily the work of free and enslaved African Americans, was assisted by abolitionists and others sympathetic to the cause of the escapees. The people who worked for the Underground Railroad had a passion for justice and would drive to end the practice of slavery, a drive so strong that they risked their lives and jeopardized their own freedom to help enslaved people escape from bondage and keep them safe along the route. Moreover, as the network grew, the railroad metaphor stuck. Conductors guided runaway enslaved people from place to place along the routes. The places that sheltered the runaways were referred to as stations, and the people who hid the enslaved people were called station masters. The fugitives traveling along the routes were called passengers, and those who had arrived at the safe houses were called cargo. Research has shown that most of those who participated in the Underground Railroad largely worked alone, rather than as part of an organized group. There were people from many occupations and income levels, including former enslaved persons. According to historical accounts of the railroad, conductors often posed as enslaved people and snuck the runaways out of plantations. Also, due to the dangers associated with capture, they conducted much of their activity at night. The conductors and passengers would travel from safe house to safe house, often with 16 to 19 kilometers, that is 10 to 20 miles, between each stop. Various other routes led to Mexico, where slavery had been abolished, and to islands in the Caribbean that were not part of the slave trade. During the American Civil War, freedom seekers escaped to Union lines in the South to obtain their freedom. One estimate suggests that by 1850, approximately 100,000 slaves had escaped to freedom via the network of the Underground Railroad. Also, according to former professor of Pan-African Studies, J. Blaine Hudson, by the end of the American Civil War, 500,000 or more African Americans self-emancipated themselves from slavery on the Underground Railroad. However, estimates of the number of Black people who reached freedom varied greatly, from 40,000 to 100,000. Also, although only a small minority of Northerners participated in the Underground Railroad, its existence did much to arouse Northern sympathy for the lot of the slave in the antebellum period, at the same time convincing many Southerners that the North as a whole would never peaceably allow the institution of slavery to remain unchallenged. Nevertheless, while the Underground Railroad had many supporters in northern states, not everybody was happy about the help escaped slaves were receiving. Hence, the reverse Underground Railroad, which kidnapped Black people in northern states and forced them back into slavery in the South, was born out of this discontent and greed. However, as the name suggests, the reverse Underground Railroad played the exact opposite role of the Underground Railroad. It was a much more nefarious secret network that performed the reverse function of what the Underground Railroad was involved in. The pre-American Civil War practice of kidnapping into slavery in the United States occurred in both free and slave states, and both fugitive slaves and free Negroes were transported to slave markets and sold, often multiple times. There were also rewards for the return of fugitives. 3 types of kidnapping methods were employed. 1, physical abduction. 2, inveiglement, that is, kidnapping through trickery of free Blacks. And 3, apprehension of fugitives. The enslavement or re-enslavement of free Blacks occurred for 85 years, from 1780 to 1865. Those who used the term reverse Underground Railroad were angered at an Underground Railroad helping slaves escape. Rescues of Blacks who had been kidnapped were unusual. The name is a reference to the Underground Railroad, the informal network of abolitionists and sympathizers who helped smuggle escaped slaves to freedom, generally in Canada, but also in Mexico, where slavery had been abolished. Free African Americans were often kidnapped from the southernmost free states, along the borders of the slave states of Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. But kidnapping was also prevalent in states further north, such as New York, Pennsylvania, and Illinois, as well as in abolition-minded regions of some southern states, such as Tennessee. Free Blacks in New York City and Philadelphia were particularly vulnerable to kidnapping. In New York, a gang known as the Black Birders regularly waylaid men, women, and children, sometimes with the support and participation of policemen and city officials. In Philadelphia, Black newspapers frequently ran missing children notices, including one for the 14-year-old daughter of the newspaper's editor. Children were particularly susceptible to kidnapping. In a 2-year period, at least 100 children were abducted in Philadelphia alone. From 1811 to 1829, Martha Patty Cannon, an illegal slave trader, serial killer, and the co-leader of the multiracial Cannon-Johnson gang of Maryland, Delaware, was the leader of a gang that kidnapped slaves and free Blacks from the Delmarva Peninsula of Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, and Chesapeake Bay, and transported and sold them to plantation owners located further south. The group operated for about a decade in the early 19th century and abducted hundreds of free Black people and fugitive slaves across multiple state lines to sell into slavery in southern states such as Alabama and Mississippi. She was indicted for 4 murders in 1829 and died in prison while awaiting trial, purportedly a suicide via arsenic poisoning. Historian Richard Bell, who teaches early American history at the University of Maryland, explained that the catalyst for the development of this network was a legislation in 1808 that outlawed the import of humans from Africa and the Caribbean for slave labor. This had a significant economic impact for Deep South states like Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, who faced a shortage of forced labor, mostly for cotton production. They were compelled to use American-born labor, but legitimately purchasing slaves from other slave owners was expensive, and supply did not meet the increased demand. Instead, they turned to illegal smuggling of free Black people to the South from northern states. Thus, between 1808 and the Civil War, tens of thousands of free Black individuals were snatched, most never to be heard from again by their loved ones. The slave market continued to grow in the country alongside the cotton market in the southwestern states. A slave that would sell for $300 in Virginia would get as much as $1,200 in states in the Southwest. As a result, a trade developed even among states in the South, where slaves born in a southern state would be sold to other states. It became such a profitable business as the price per slave continued to grow year after year, fueling the kidnapping surge. Like the better-known Underground Railroad, the Reverse Underground Railroad was loosely organized and operated in secrecy. Traffic on both was roughly the same, moving hundreds of individuals annually. But while the Underground Railroad is seen as a good organization, helping Black people escape the evils of enslavement, the Reverse Underground Railroad was just the opposite, cruelly taking free individuals and enslaving them. Moreover, Bell stated that unlike the Underground Railroad, where there is considerable documented historical information, little documentation is found on the Reverse Underground Railroad and those involved. Bribes, corruption, and apathy protected the operatives, with police turning a blind eye to their activities and white people showing indifference. Sadly, the kidnappers mostly targeted poor, often illiterate or homeless, young street kids, both boys and girls. Philadelphia was a popular target because it was the closest major free city to the slavery states in the South. The kidnapped individuals were forced to walk incredibly long distances, and many were sold off one by one along the route. Unlike slave auctions of the time, where records of sales were typically recorded, there are few records of what happened to many of these individuals. Also, during the pre-Civil War period, child snatching was prevalent and Black freedom very fragile, as even free Black people were not safe or protected. In addition to capturing free Black people from the northern states, kidnappers and traffickers of the Reverse Underground Railroad also worked to recapture slaves that had managed to escape. Many kidnappers, however, used trickery to lure Black people into slavery. For example, in the book, A Portraiture of Domestic Slavery, author Jesse Torrey tells the story of a man from Philadelphia who forced mixed-race women into marrying him and then sold them as slaves. Also, kidnappers sometimes approached a free Black person with a job offer or claimed a free Black person was actually a runaway slave. And with no proof to the contrary, the law often sided with them. In a paper published in the Pennsylvania Magazine of History and Biography, researcher Julie Winch gave another example of kidnappers tricking parents with a promise that their child could learn a trade, only to then disappear with that child on the way to the South and never be seen again. These and many other schemes were adopted to kidnap free Black people and runaway slaves, throwing them back into another harrowing experience of slavery, and for the sole aim of making whooping sums out of them. The most famous story involving the Reverse Underground Railroad is that of Solomon Northup, whose story was popularized in the 2013 Oscar-winning movie, 12 Years a Slave. Northup was born a free man in New York in 1807, and throughout his younger life worked as a farmer and laborer on his family farm, as his father was a freed slave who owned his own land. He also played the violin in his free time, according to Britannica. By 1841, Northup, his wife, and his children were living in another city, where he was earning a living through odd jobs. It was there that he was approached by two men and offered a job as a violin player in the circus. On the contrary, there was no circus and no job, but just a ploy to scoop him away. When Northup arrived in Washington, D.C., he was drugged and kidnapped. He was eventually sold at a slave market in Louisiana and spent the following 12 years as a slave. A New York Times article from 1853, via Documenting the American South, recounts the condition in which Northup lived for over a decade, including being lashed by his master, sleeping on a wooden board with no mattress, and living in a poorly constructed space that offered little protection from the elements. It wasn't until 1852 that Northup managed to send a letter to friends in New York City who put things in motion and eventually helped release him. Moreover, Richard Bell notes that many details of Northup's story are unusual, and that he was well-educated and middle-aged. Most kidnappers preferred instead to lure away poorly educated children with various ruses. In fact, the abduction of Black children from northern cities was so common that parents and communities were on guard against it. Bell writes,
"At home each night before bed and again over breakfast the next morning, parents pestered their sons and daughters to stay in large groups, to read body language, to steer clear of certain streets, and to be wary of promises too good to be true."
But that was often not enough to withstand the unscrupulous con men who ran the railroad. Furthermore, the Reverse Underground Railroad might not have been as organized in its route planning as the Underground Railroad, but kidnappers had plans and hiding spaces in place to help them move captured people to the southern states. Even if stopped or discovered along the way, many had false bills of sale to explain the black men or children traveling with them. The kidnapping routes often included a brief stop in a basement or out-of-the-way property before they could be ushered into boats, heading to the south via the waters of Maryland and Delaware. These water routes could take a week or longer, and once captors and captured slaves arrived in the south, they would be taken to houses of slave owners or other kidnappers before they would move on to their next stop deeper south. Routes usually included a mix of water and road transportation, as well as a long trek to their final destination, which made it easier to conceal the kidnappers' tracks. The travel conditions of the kidnapped were deadly. While being kidnapped was in itself a traumatic experience, for most captured free black people, this was just the beginning of the nightmare. After the capture, their grueling route towards southern states would start. Their journey there included a trip in a vessel resembling a dungeon, being shackled in a windowless room, and a 1,000-mile-long trek to the south that was accomplished mostly by walking. Captured free black people marching to their final destination were often whipped along the way for things like complaining and walking too slowly. Other reports detail instances of frostbite along the route, and many died along the way, unable to complete the trek. Sadly, very little was done to deal with the kidnappings. Kidnappers were rarely caught, and even more, rarely punished. As victim testimony wasn't available, it was easy for kidnappers to change their names or move somewhere else to continue with their business. And with information circulating quite slowly among the population, so many weren't aware of the risks around them, according to a paper published in the Pennsylvania Magazine of History and Biography. Furthermore, well-organized kidnapping rings were particularly tricky to identify and penalize, as captured free black people could be moved towards southern states quickly before anybody could catch the kidnappers. Although the network of kidnappers in the reverse Underground Railroad was extensive, some kidnappers became infamous for their tactics, brutality, or simply the number of people they kidnapped. Patty Cannon and the Cannon-Johnson gang are good examples of the kidnap pins. Led by a woman and operating in the Delaware and Maryland area, the gang was responsible for kidnapping and selling hundreds of free black people into slavery, according to a historical marker located near the border of Delaware and Maryland. When Cannon's former slave, Cyrus James, was caught, he told the court he had seen Cannon murder several people, including a black woman's child. While most of the gang managed to escape, Cannon was arrested but died in her cell while awaiting trial. In closing, the reverse Underground Railroad serves as a poignant reminder of the complexities of history and the enduring struggle for freedom and justice. While the original Underground Railroad symbolized hope and the relentless pursuit of liberty for enslaved individuals, the reverse Underground Railroad highlights the darker aspects of human nature, betrayal, exploitation, and the systemic forces that sought to undermine that very freedom. Ultimately, the legacy of the reverse Underground Railroad serves as a call to action. It urges us to remain vigilant against the forces of injustice and to advocate for those who are marginalized and oppressed. By acknowledging and learning from this painful history, we can foster a deeper understanding of our shared humanity and work towards a future where freedom is not just a privilege for some, but a fundamental right for all. However, that brings us to the end of yet another interesting video segment. Did you happen to learn a thing or two? Share your thoughts with us in the comment section below. We are always delighted to pick from your thoughts. Also, support our works by hitting that like button in front of you. Share with your families and friends to keep spreading.
Man. So they had a network set up of the opposite of what the Underground Railroad was. And that was a reality that existed. Now, sadly, looks like on Facebook, I got a notification that they blocked my content because of some of the stills that they used in the video, or some of the background videos that they used, probably that 12 Years a Slave or whatever the case. So they got a flag for that on Facebook. But nevertheless, the information did go out and is available on YouTube as well as Twitch. And so, man, Yeah, this is hard to deal with, hard to operate in, to think that they, have done such horrible things to our people as they have, and we've just been subject to these things without resolution. And it's here we are now, just hoping things stay together uh, and not fall apart, because we're at a place now where we feel like things are okay, and reality, we might be kind of okay, but we're not. It could go awry, truthfully,
Mhm.
quickly, very quickly. So, um, you know, I really hope that we're learning from these videos. I know I am. I know I am. But I hope that viewers are learning from these videos and understanding that these things are not, um, these things are real, and these situations are harsh. The dealing with these situations are very harsh and difficult to deal with. But the reality is, um, that this is not some movie or a nightmare or something that can be explained away. This is the reality that our people have faced in these societies. This happened in America, but guess what? There were similar situations happening all over the earth for our people. These were the situations that happened and are still happening in some places, in some cases, right here to this day. So I really hope that we're learning from these things and understanding that the reason that these things happen wasn't because we were able to be dominated so easily, and it was easy for people to just get one over on us. But these things were happening because uh, we chose not to keep the way that our power had given us, that the Most High had given us, and made us subject to our adversaries, to our enemies. And when those things happen, that's what we had to deal with. So it is what it is. I mean, it's not is what it is. I don't mean to say that, but these things really did occur, and it's hard to deal with. It's hard to understand, and it's hard to uh, it's just overall it's hard. It's difficult. But again, I do hope that we're learning from these things, and I'm gonna rest there. Go ahead, Aki.
Kanaki, if you could pull First Timothy 1 and we'll begin reading it. We just want verse 9 and 10.
All right. First Timothy chapter 1 and verse 9. Let me put it on the screen here. All
Or
right.
begin at verse 8, Slakia.
Okay, no sweat. The book of First Timothy, chapter number 1. Oh, I'm sorry. Chapter number 1, verse 8. But we know that the law, the Torah, is good if a man uses it lawfully, knowing this, that the law is not made for righteous men, but for the lawless and disobedient, for the unrighteous, and for sinners, for unset apart people, or for the unset apart and profane, for murderers of fathers and murderers of mothers, and for manslayers. Verse 10, for whoremongers, for them that defile themselves with mankind, for man stealers, for liars, for uh, perjurous persons, and if there be anything that is contrary to sound doctrine.
Kanak. So the stealing of men is something that is contrary to sound doctrine. It is contrary to the law, the Torah. This is not pleasing to the Most High. What we were listening in about, all of that, understand that the Abba allowed it to happen, not for their good, but because he wants to do the work. He wants to send his son to redeem his people and also judge these folks for their actions. I remember us covering the Northrop story, the 12 years a slave story. Right. And I had no idea that it was so common. Now I knew that there were agencies throughout, the South and the Midwest, Northern Kentucky, Ohio, Indiana areas of slave catchers, people whose profession was the recapturing of runaway slaves. That was big business. I had no idea that they were going into Philadelphia and stealing the children of our people who were free up there. Yeah. Sending them into bondage in the South. And for the most part, these folks think that they have gotten away with it, and it does appear that they've gotten away, but that's not going to be the case. And don't get me wrong, because anything that any of us have done, we will give an account of it. However, the Most High is going to continue to choose your code, right? And He has good plans for His people. Not so for these nations. Exactly. I digress.
Exactly. Accountability is going to be made. All accounts will be reconciled. And when your account is reconciled, whatever you owe on the book, it's going to have to be paid. You ain't going to get away. He's not going to let it slide. You're going to have to pay up. And that's going to be what it is. It's disheartening now, but we know in the end we win. Mm-hmm. Because the Most High have already told the prophets that we win. So that's what we got to look forward to. In the meantime, the reason we do these is because we want to see our people saved. Romans chapter 10 and verse 1. Brethren, my heart's desire and prayer to Ha'abba for Israel is that they might be saved. How are we going to be saved? Simple and plain. We have to keep the belief in Hamashiach, the Messiah, as well as keeping the Torah, the instruction, much like we read in 1 Timothy. Also in Ecclesiastes chapter number 12 and verse number 13, let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear the Most High and keep His commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. It is so very important that we understand that in the conclusion of the whole matter, we are to fear the Most High and keep His commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. At the end of the day, when it is all said and done, all the dust is settled and all the smoke is clear, we will be judged on whether we have feared the Most High and kept His commandments. Why? For this is the whole duty of man. I am your Akazaki Yahu, joined by my most esteemed Akinanaya on this new moon. I kind of hate we dampened it so bad, but these have to be understood. We have to understand that this has been the history of our people, and we have to understand that you can't trust the people that the Most High used to whoop us and try to get us back to Him. Through all the adversity and situations that we've had to deal with, the Most High is still good, and we still have His promises. So to the 12 tribes of Israel who are scattered through the four quarters of the earth, I say to you all, Shalom wa Baruchim, that is peace and blessings. And I cannot wait till the day when the Most High gathers us once again, and we are once again 12 tribes, one family, one nation, under the Most High, under one covenant, back in our own land with a heart of flesh and no more a heart of stone, with our enemies, our adversaries, and all those who hate us under our feet. Until that day come, shalom, family.
Shalom, shalom, Mr. Picard.
All praises to the Abba. Praise you, Abba Yah. Barak Hashem, Yahweh.